Welcome to Tate Britain, a treasure trove bursting with masterpieces.
Right, we're going to have a good time.
And home to the National Collection of British Art.
I know what I like, and I like this.
I'm Gus Casely-Hayford. As an art curator and a cultural historian, I've been lucky enough to work with some of the finest institutions in the country. But this series is pretty special. With unique access to Tate Britain,
It is very moving for me to see that.
I'm going to take you on a journey into the scenes of some of the nation's most loved landscape paintings.
Look at that.
And I'm not alone, because I'm going to be joined by some of the finest showmen and showwomen.
I played about 10 characters, including a horse, naked.
We'll walk in the artist's footsteps, rediscovering their secrets and their inspirational views.
This is it.
Some as if the artist just left them,
Rowing into history.
and others completely transformed.
This is the Hogarth roundabout.
This is the actual site where the three miners probably sat.
Like they were waiting for a bus.
Exactly.
So sit back and enjoy the view, or better still, follow in my footsteps.
Oh, bugger it. Why was I born so short?
Today, we're going to begin a journey into the world of Alfred Wallis. I fell in love with Alfred Wallis when I first saw one of his paintings that captures a ship in a Cornish bay. And I was utterly hooked. And I'm going to be joined by someone who is every bit as much in love with him as I am. And that's Miriam Margolyes, actor, writer, but all-round national treasure. And together, we want to get under the enigma of this man, Wallis. Born in 1855, Alfred Wallis was an artist fisherman who was completely untrained. He didn't pick up a paintbrush until he was in his 70s. In my view, he's been almost completely overlooked by art history and patronised with the title naive artist. His work deemed simplistic and childlike. Wallis may not be considered one of the great masters, but I believe his landscapes are just as significant as the titan of great British art, Turner. Turner may command his own wing for his grand seascapes, but Wallis's work is on a more modest scale and needs to be appreciated up close. So as it's Miriam Margolyes, Tate Britain have given us exclusive access to an Alfred Wallis painting.
There must be thousands of pictures.
There are a huge number.
It's been taken out of the gallery and closeted away in a library room, and we're going to see it up close.
This is the Holy of Holies.
Yeah, we're very, very lucky. This is Alfred Wallis.
Wow.
Isn't that wonderful?
Oh, I love it.
St. Ives, painted by Alfred Wallis in 1928, when he was 73, and this was the coastal view near his cottage in Cornwall. Go on, I dare you, say it, a child could do this. But look a little closer, and this painting is full of considered motifs that reflect his life story. You have a connection to Wallis, don't you?
When I was a student at Cambridge, Jim Eade, who ran Kettle's Yard, he allowed students to rent a picture from his gallery, and I rented one for a term. It was of a sailing boat, and I looked at it and I just loved it straight away.
What was particular about Wallis that attracted you?
Well, you feel that it's personal, and when I saw the one that I rented all those years ago, I just smiled. You know, it gives you a little crumb of joy.
Yes.
I didn't know that he was himself a fisherman.
But he actually goes to sea as a boy. This is when it's all about sail.
and the vulnerability of a young boy on, you know, on one of these ships, sailing across the Atlantic. And he seems to be able to recall things from the trips that he took. And he paints icebergs and he paints whales and he paints very kind of complex ships with all kinds of different rigging. This is someone who was mapping very, very accurately what he saw and making sense of it for himself in a way that is very, very profound.
Made me cry.
Oh.
Isn't that amazing?
It makes me emotional as well. I think to make sense of these, one has to go down into this environment. It's something quintessential about that bit of Cornwall that I think he captures, and I think we have to go there, really.
I'm up for it.
Okay, let's go.
Take me.
St. Ives, Cornwall, on the southwest coast. For generations, this has been an artist colony, with painters attracted by the weather and the exquisite light. In 1877, the railway arrived, and this tiny coastal town was transformed. Turner came by train to paint here, and Whistler and Sickert soon followed. Artists were now connected with London, where they could transport and exhibit their work for the very first time. It might take over 6 hours to get here from London, but this is no ordinary journey. Nothing can prepare you for the magic as St. Ives reveals itself to you as you wind your way around the coast. A journey that artists have been making for over 130 years.
Oh, that was good.
It's gorgeous going right along the edge of the coast, isn't it? You get
Yes,
a real
love
sense of St.
But
Ives.
you're really on the edge.
Yes, the adventure begins.
Yeah.
For our first walk, we're going right into Wallace's world, through the scenes of his most important works, beginning in the Warren, a jumble of fishermen's cottages, past the harbour view and his famous lighthouses, and through the cobbled back streets and ending in the scene of our painting next door to his home. You can see what artists would love about it. It's just not the architecture, but some of the views that you get.
Oh, this is great.
And there is that iconic harbour view, and scene of one of his most famous paintings, harbour with 2 lighthouses and a motor vessel. For the fisherman Wallace, those lighthouses were key to his survival, a beacon of safety, and it's a motif he returned to time and time again in his art. Godrevy Lighthouse to the right wasn't just significant to Wallace, but to the writer Virginia Woolf, who based her novel To the Lighthouse on the very same view. Wow. He's captured it, and it's a sort of fisherman's eye view. For a fisherman, it tells you everything that is essential to navigate these waters, where the rocks jut out into the water.
Yes, I see.
Oh, the idea that in any way that this could be considered to be simple or naive, I think is silly, because it's mapping this particular bay in a really considered, thoughtful way. I think he's just so clever. It's all so sweet, isn't it? Everywhere you look, there are things that one would like to paint or to capture.
I know. I just think about buying houses. Because I always want to live in a place.
There's something I want to show you down here, Miriam. I mean, have a look at that.
Oh.
Do you recognise?
Well, yeah.
Look, there's a whole wall.
Oh, my goodness.
I think the old man, Fisherman Wallace, will be surprised to know he's inspired a whole industry of artists here. It's as if every street corner there's a gallery, tantalising tourists with their St. Ives scenes.
It's always sad if it's a copy. You know, they're copying.
Yeah.
Are they seeing?
Exactly.
£95?
What do you think?
Blimey, well, I've gone off it now.
Have you? Oh dear. So for an authentic slice of Wallace, we need to head to the coast. Our walk is going to finish right on the site of our Tate painting. It's great to think he would have actually walked these streets.
I know, that's what's amazing, isn't it, to think of that?
And these views, I imagine, were one of the things that made him want to take to paint and canvas. And this is our St. Ives view. Like the vast majority of his work, it's an imagined world, a bird's eye view of the place he intimately knew. And it's that bird's eye style that is trademark Wallace. He elevated himself above the scene, highlighting only the places that were significant to him. That is the view of St. Nicholas that he puts into the back of
That's the chapel.
the chapel on the hill. He's made a kind of a composite of, obviously,
Yes,
a lot
I
of
see that.
different buildings that he thought were important. He picks out religious buildings and lighthouses as the things by which he wants us to, in some way, kind of pass some level of significance.
Apart from boats, that contains his world, doesn't it?
Exactly. The church, fishing, his neighbourhood, this wonderful place of St. Ives, those were the things that made up all the points of inspiration.
What we're looking at now is what he saw. I love that.
Wallace's paintings were of what he knew and deeply personal to him. So next stop, Penzance, to uncover the scenes of his early life, the little boy who went to sea and returned a man. And Miriam and I take to the high seas to see St. Ives through Wallace's eyes.
Look at that. Hello. Hello. Isn't that fantastic?
I'm here in Cornwall with the incorrigible Miriam Margolyes.
That was the train farting.
It wasn't. It wasn't. Don't look at me. Retracing the footsteps of fisherman artist Alfred Wallis, the untrained painter who took the art world by storm, with its intimate scenes of the coast. Just 8 miles from his former home in St. Ives is the harbour town of Penzance. Before I meet Miriam, I'm going to walk the scenes of Wallace's early life, where his boyhood adventures began. Past his former home, the church where he married, and ending at Newlyn Harbour, over 2 miles in the footsteps of the artist. We start our walk in the back streets of Penzance, where Wallace moved in 1865 as a boy. His mother had died from tuberculosis, and his father moved his sons to this thriving seaport. The fishing industries were booming, and these streets would have been paved with opportunity. Well, you can never forget that these are fishing villages. Every street seems to give way at its end to a vista of the sea. It must have been magical for the young Wallace to have witnessed all the ships and pleasure boats coming in and out of the harbour. And the first stop of our journey encapsulates all of the boyhood wonder of those early days. This is the Admiral Benbow. It's the setting for the first chapter of Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson's 1883 novel. And you can imagine growing up with this just round the corner from where you lived. And I can remember reading it, and it transported me. But for a young Wallace, this must have been a place of real inspiration and possibilities. Wallace, he goes to sea at the age of 9, and that sense of boyhood magic never leaves him. He would later write, "Each boat has a soul, a beautiful soul shaped like a fish." But Wallace's story is even more fantastical than the plot of Treasure Island. It's hard to imagine now, but extreme poverty forced the motherless Wallace to be sent to work on deep-sea fishing boats, away for months at a time in places as far-flung as Newfoundland and Labrador in Canada. It must have been utterly jaw-dropping to see those other worlds at such a young age. On return from one of his epic journeys, the 20-year-old Wallace moved in here and fell in love with his landlady, the formidable Susan Ward. This is the house where Wallace spends his formative years, and you can tell how much it obviously impacted him. It's just like houses in his paintings. Wonderful. It was an odd setup, even for 1876. The widowed Susan was 21 years older than Wallace, and she had 5 children already. But they married here at St. Mary's Church, and it was almost perfect. She anchored him as he departed and returned from this coastline as a young man. But these trips were often harrowing, and I have a theory that Wallace later suffered a kind of post-traumatic stress. So it's here at Newling Harbour, the end of our walk, I'm meeting Chaplain Keith of the Fisherman's Mission, who's counselled those who've experienced firsthand the terror of the sea. Wallace, he goes to sea as a young boy. It must have just been pretty traumatic, mustn't it, for a young boy?
I think so. I think particularly being at sea and particularly fishing in years gone by, they were hard men. Physically, emotionally, you know, and you're in this small boat in the middle of the North Atlantic in bad weather with a few guys and nothing else. You know, I think that, as you say, would be traumatic. What he must have gone through, I think that lingers with him for the rest of his life. I mean, is that something that you would recognise that? Yeah, you talk to guys who have survived a boat going down, and I can think of a case just a few years ago in which they lost one of their crewmates, and 2 of them survived, and they can't even come down the harbour now. They're no longer fishing. They literally cannot look at the harbour because of that trauma that the loss of that crewmate had for them. We refer on guys for counselling with post-traumatic stress disorder because it does leaves a scar. Because I think that stress is part of what informs his work. The painting becomes part of a cathartic process of him being able to deal with the trauma. It seems to be, in some way, therapeutic. It's a ferocious environment and it's an unforgiving environment. You're at the mercy of wave and wind. And as you say, they find ways of working through it. Sometimes it's a pub, sometimes it's painting. But, you know, you're there with 4 other people in this tiny boat in the middle of a vast ocean, and it does give us a different perspective on life, I think, that we who spend our life ashore don't have. Yes.
But there's one event in Wallace's life that led him to create one of his most dramatic paintings, The Wreck of the Alba, which he painted at the age of 83, an event that shook the community of St. Ives to its core. Back in St. Ives, Miriam and I are taking a trip right into the scene of that painting.
What a perfect day. This is like the best treat I could ever have.
Isn't it glorious?
It's hard to imagine on a perfectly still day such as this that the sea could be so treacherous. But in a storm, against those rocks, conditions would have been dire. On one occasion, 1938, the Alba, this huge ship, comes into these waters, gets into trouble, and is rammed against those rocks over there. He is there, and They send out the lifeboat crew to try and rescue the men, and 5 of the crew go over the side and die. And it's a real tragedy. It's something that he captures in a number of paintings.
Wallace was deeply affected by the wreck. The scenes are frenzied and chaotic, with the sea a violent, dominant force overpowering the ship.
I just love the way that he's put the lighthouse where he wants it to be.
Yes.
But perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Alba is that the shipwreck could have been avoided altogether. The lighthouse was unmanned. Cornwall had recently been connected with electricity, and the captain mistook the light of the lighthouse for the harbour. Man's modern invention had ultimately been the ship's demise.
It just gives a little insight into the way in which his brain worked and the way in which he constructed his paintings. They're not just simple depictions. He's telling us stories about this particular place and what was important to him. So many of his paintings show ships coming into this bay.
He loved to come home. He wanted
Coming
them
home.
to come home.
And Wallace, obviously, that he loved this community and saw it as his sanctuary. I mean, are there things that give you the same feeling of security? I mean, where do you feel?
Where do I feel safe?
Yes, safe.
On a stage, I think.
Really?
Yeah. Safer than off stage.
In front of hundreds of people?
Yeah. On stage, I know what I'm doing, and I know that the people in the audience are my friends. I
Yes.
feel that. Off stage, you don't know. You can be destroyed off stage. On stage, you only destroy yourself.
Gosh.
It's different. We talked about the ships coming into safe harbour. I suppose for Alfred Wallis, that was a good time when a sailor sees the land.
Wallace wasn't a rugged man. He was...
Just a wee boy. He was a little snivelter of a person. Yeah. He must have felt great relief coming in.
St. Ives, Cornwall. For over 50 years, the fisherman artist Alfred Wallis called this place home. For decades, Wallace has been relegated by art history as a simple, uneducated man. But I want to walk you through the scenes of his life that blow those theories out of the water. This next walk is going to debunk some common myths about the man. So before I meet Miriam, I'm going to take you on an early morning walk through St. Ives Harbour, beginning at the lifeboat station, past the Salvation Army, one of the key foundations of his life, up onto the island, high above the beach, and ending at St. Nicholas Chapel, the patron saint of sailors and Christmas. Wallace moved to St. Ives with Susan, aged 35. After periods of long separation from his wife and tumultuous journeys at sea, he must have felt great relief to finally be anchored here.
It's changed hugely, but you still get a sense of how this cove feels like a community. I mean, it's almost like an amphitheatre reaching in to embrace people. I mean, at its centre, this is about fishing. This is about people who would risk their lives on a daily basis. And so religion was enormously important. And Wallace, as a member of the Salvation Army, he would celebrate that on a weekly basis down here on the slipway where the band would play. I mean, there would be hundreds of people down here, and you could imagine them singing booming hymns, and what a setting for it. I mean, this is a kind of religion that wasn't just about an abstract God. This was a religion that bound this community together, that made sense of it.
This close-knit community witnessed a dramatic shift in the fishing industry during Wallace's lifetime. Sailboats were being replaced by modern steamships. Far from being sweet, naive pictures of boats, Wallace's paintings documented a world that has been lost forever. They're of huge significance. These changes had an enormous impact on these small fishing communities, and in hard times, some turned to wrecking to survive. Ships would run aground, either in stormy weather or sometimes as a result of a deliberate act of sabotage. Locals would lie in wait, ready to steal a ship's cargo. This was a murky world that Wallace found impossible to avoid.
When he finishes his time on the sea, he turns his hand to being a bit of a local businessman. He isn't the simple Wallace that art history would seem to paint.
In 1890, Wallace set up as a marine store dealer here, buying scrap iron, sails and rope. For over 20 years, this was where Wallace traded salvage with locals.
And this building is where Wallace established his marine stores. I mean, marine stores is, and that's an interesting description. It was more of a rag and bone man. And I have an image of him as a bit of a Del boy, wheeler dealing. And there's an amazing picture of out here as a donkey and cart outside. And you get a sense that he had his fingers in all sorts of pies.
In 1895, Wallace was embroiled in a wrecking scandal. Arrested, thrown into jail and fined. This was a time of smugglers, pirates and wreckers, a world that Wallace would have known only too well.
He's obviously a very interesting man, a full-rounded man, very complex. And you get a sense that he led here in St. Ives a really rich and interesting life.
But to truly get under the skin of this great, if unacknowledged artist, Miriam and I are going to meet one of Wallace's only surviving relatives. Up here on the island, John manages the lookout station, a lifeline to this community, keeping a watchful eye over the same stormy weather conditions that Wallace would have experienced along this wild and dangerous coast.
You have a very particular connection to him, don't you?
He was my step-great-great-grandfather. He married my great-great-grandmother. She adored him because he was such a quiet, gentle, very generous man.
It's such a tragic story, isn't it?
They say that they had 2 children who died in infancy.
Yes.
But I have got tapes of my grandmother saying that there was actually 3 children.
Oh dear.
But they all died.
In 1922, when Wallace was 67, his beloved Susan died. Wallace turned to painting for company, he said. He painted furiously on anything he could get his hands on. Cardboard, tins, saucepans, even the walls and doors of his house.
And he gives away his paintings?
He gave away his paintings. I mean, this one came from a collection that was given to his next-door neighbour.
You've got one
You've
there.
got one?
This is one here. This is a drawing on a Woodbine packet, a cigarette packet.
Oh, my God.
Do you want to see it?
Yeah.
Please.
You should be wearing white gloves.
I should be. Look at that, holding an Alfred Wallis.
It's hard to believe that we're actually
Yes,
looking at
isn't it?
something that he did.
Yes.
I think it's got a bit of his dinner on it as well.
That's
bit of his dinner.
That's authentic. How authentic can it be? Oh, my goodness. Bless his dear soul.
It's wonderful to meet you, John, and what a privilege, not just to see an Alfred Wallis, but to actually be able to handle it and to speak to one of his
You take care of
relatives.
it, don't you?
Yes.
Should put that in a bank.
It's actually in my safe.
Good.
When Wallace was in his 70s, he'd become increasingly isolated. The grief he felt from losing Susan wreaked havoc with his mind. He became paranoid and suffered delusions. His art was a way of making sense of the world and his fractured adult mind. But the part of Wallace's life that he hung on to, that anchored him, even in his most troubled times, was faith. This is St. Nicholas Chapel, the patron saint of sailors, a place he returned to many times in his art.
It's obviously a great source of comfort for Wallace that he keeps returning to this as a motif in his paintings.
Even when the chapel shouldn't be there, when it wasn't there from his viewpoint, he put it there. He needed it to be there.
Yes.
No doubt he believed.
Yes, yeah. Particularly the last 20 years of his life, beyond the point where he loses his wife and then his family begin to drift away from him. He's quite isolated, and I think religion and his painting are the things that keep him going. And that sense of being an outsider is that something that you can identify with?
I certainly know what it is to be an outsider. I am a fat, short, Jewish lesbian. Can there be anything more outside? I've always felt that, always. And it's not a bad thing,
Yeah.
I think, because it stops you from behaving too smugly. But you can only do what you think is right.
Yeah.
And that is, in a sense, the God in all of us. I think that Alfred Wallis, in his small world, would agree. Just coming here, you do feel, I think, closer to him.
Yes.
Well, it's lovely, and we must put some money in. So I'm going to put it in. Okay.
So he's given us Christmas and he's looked after sailors, so deserves
Push that in so nobody can get it out. That's right.
Well, thank you.
Look at that view. That's a holy view, if you like.
These views, these scenes, you can see why Wallace felt so compelled to paint here. But how did a fisherman who had never had an art lesson in his life not only captivate the art world, but change the face of modern British art forever? I'm on the trail of Alfred Wallis, a man who changed British art forever. And for our last walk, Miriam and I are on a journey that will reveal Wallace's incredible legacy. Beginning in the Downalong, the back streets full of fishermen's cottages, past his former home, the world-famous Barbara Hepworth studio, Barnoon Cemetery, where the artist was finally laid to rest, and ending at Porthmere Studios, the beachside studios that have inspired some of art's most legendary names. St. Ives has an undeniable charm. You can see why artists and tourists have been drawn here. But these days, there's barely a trace of the authentic fishing communities of Wallace's day.
Everyone
Yes.
is a holiday cottage. I wish they'd named them slightly better. Drop Anchor and Happy Days Cottage. It's a bit sick-making.
I wonder what Wallace would make of it.
I don't know. Because it stops being their town, doesn't it? It becomes a town that belongs to the incomers.
Yes.
It's a shame that St. Ives has now become a place you're more likely to see a 4x4 than a fishing net. But one of the last true remaining fisherman families still remains, although not for too long.
Why are you selling?
Sadly, St. Ives isn't the same as when I grew up. It's a lot of the houses here now are second homes, holiday accommodation, and we're the last permanent residents to live in the street.
Really?
Yes. The place was buzzing when I was a youngster here. Fishermen would be here now with their wheelbarrows, wheeling the nets and the pots down to the quay. The harbour was full of boats. The smell of the fish. It was something which I cherish, and the memories which live on, but sadly they will be no longer for future generations.
It's the passing of an important way of life, I think. Permanent residence in St. Ives.
This down along may be out of me, but it's always in.
Yeah.
Ta-ra.
Bye-bye.
I feel for him, because the world that he grew up in is finished.
Yes.
It's over.
The old fishing communities may have disappeared from St. Ives, but thankfully the house where he was discovered as an artist still remains. In 1928, a visiting artist, Ben Nicholson, discovered Wallace painting inside his home. Utterly captivated by the simplicity of his work, their chance meeting captured in this incredible photograph moments later.
What are you going to show me?
This, and it's actually quite a humble little house, but this is the house of the great man.
Stop. You've got to look. Look at this house. Do you read English? Yes,
Yes.
Alfred Wallis.
Yes.
Do you know who he is?
He was an artist.
Are you a fan?
Great artist.
I've seen him, I'm not sure.
What do you mean you're not sure?
The bits I've seen are relatively simple.
But what's wrong with that? He was a fisherman, and
Yeah.
he's seeing it from a seaman's point of view. Look at it again.
Yes, I'll have a look
Please,
again.
because
Yeah.
he's a great artist.
Miriam has told you, so you.
Yeah, I must have a look.
Yes,
Must have a look. Pay attention.
Well,
All right.
Lovely to meet you.
Yeah, good to meet you.
You take care.
Bye.
And look,
This
I
is
want
the
to do
house.
something, Miriam. You stand here on the step. I want to try something out. To replicate.
Gosh! Will you take one of me?
Why not? Grumpy look. Perfect.
The revolutionary abstract artist Nicholson and his wife, Barbara Hepworth, had moved to St. Ives seeking fresh inspiration, and they found in Wallace their muse. It was the beginning of a new direction in British modern art. Now, world-famous artists such as Nicholson, Patrick Heron, and Wilhelmina Barnes-Graham were inspired by him. And it's astonishing how much of Wallace's influence you can see in their work. Hepworth herself said of Wallace, "He didn't know how much we all learned and took of him." So to see Wallace's legacy firsthand, Miriam and I are going to Barbara Hepworth's sculpture garden and former studio. I'm interested to see what Miriam thinks of Wallace's great contribution to modern art.
Are you a fan of Hepworth and Nicholson?
All I can see is just holes. And I want to fill them up. Fill them in. The problem is that with art, there's such a lot of pretentiousness, and it's very easy to become incredibly silly talking about art. And really, one should just look at it, and either it grabs you by the balls or it doesn't.
Right.
And I'm afraid
Your
just
balls
I'm
aren't
ungrabbed. That's all I can say. Now that, of course, is just utterly absurd. I'm sorry, but I think she's having a laugh. I don't want to take it seriously, and I can't.
I've got to argue on Barbara Hepworth's behalf.
I know. I know.
She, like her partner Ben Nicholson, they find in Wallace a kind of hero, that they are looking for a kind of authenticity that they feel is lacking.
For Nicholson and Hepworth, Wallace was the Holy Grail. He painted with a kind of innocence and freedom that they both desperately craved. They believed for art to be truly authentic, it needed to be uninhibited, free from the constraints of artistic training, from the shackles of art history. It was a new way of seeing, a fresh way of thinking, raw, unrefined, and direct.
I truly think that it's a lack in me that doesn't see what Barbara Hepworth is trying to do.
I think
but I can't help it. That's it. That's how
if you
I
don't
am.
see it in the art, it's never a failure on the part of the viewer. I just think leave it alone. Life's too short. If this doesn't work for you, then fine.
Okay. Bye-bye, Barbara.
Goodbye, Barbara. Babs, it's been fun, but it's just not worked out.
In his late 80s, Wallis had become reclusive, unable to manage. Heartbreakingly, he was moved into a local poorhouse where he later died, painting right up until the very end of his days. Utterly aghast at plans to bury him in a pauper's grave, Barbara Hepworth, Ben Nicholson, and other local artists honoured him with this poignant gravestone by master potter Bernard Leach. He was given the full Salvation Army funeral, which all attended, a fitting tribute to a man who had contributed so much to their art. And his legacy is just as powerful today. For local artist Naomi Frears, Wallis remains a constant source of inspiration, passing his grave each day en route to her studio, part of the same set of studios where legendary artists Ben Nicholson and Francis Bacon used to paint.
I think you're right.
Oh.
Okay.
A studio.
A studio, yes.
Shall I open up the window?
Please.
Oh, you can hear it. Oh, yeah. That's a great view.
Isn't it a great view?
Is it full of people sometimes, the beach?
Yeah, semi-naked. Yeah.
Semi-naked?
Yeah. In the summer, it's completely covered.
Oh, that's very distressing.
It depends, frankly.
It's incredible to think that the same views that Wallis painted are still inspiring artists today. Just like Wallis, Naomi paints from memory and imagination in this spellbinding place.
I first saw a Wallace when I was 15 and didn't need it translating. And I'm sure it's the same for you.
Yes.
It puzzles me how somebody could look at a Wallace and not get it. I haven't seen many Wallaces that are kind of disappointing because they're just sort of undeniable, aren't they? There's nothing about them that isn't real or right.
I think he communicates immediately. It's so accessible.
Yeah.
And that, when you're someone like me who doesn't think that you know about art, it's very comforting. And I really enjoy looking at his pictures.
I feel I've really got a sense of him. And
when you come here, you do.
yes.
Because this was where he belonged, really.
Yes.
And I feel I know so much more about him now than I ever did. And I can hardly believe that all those years ago, I had a picture that came from here in my room. I'm so glad that he did live here. He could have lived in Smethwick.
Alfred Wallis, he really is a once-in-a-lifetime story. A humble fisherman who had no artistic training and yet whose raw talent changed British art forever. It's just extraordinary to think his work would end up here. To hear his story is to feel life's possibilities are limitless. And if he's taught us anything, it's that we should look beyond the seeming simplicity of what's in front of us. There's so much more to life than what first meets the eye.